From a defabricated solar-powered garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA, this is Stand Up with Pete Dominick. On today's episode, tips on editing your award-winning audio content so it doesn't sound like this. And now, the podcast host who's got fake producer Keith on the lookout for audio problems, so no worries there. Pete Dominick.
That's right, Pico. Thank you very much. We've been nominated for Worst Editing for a daily podcast for yet another year. Thank you very much for your recognition to the Academy. I am very, very flattered by yet another editing issue yesterday. Hopefully today there won't be one. But as always, if there is, you can contact me in any number of ways and let me know. We'll try to get it fixed. Hello, my friends. I've got two great guests joining me for the first time ever. I've got journalist, novelist, and co-founder of the nonprofit Humanity Now, Direct Refugee Relief, the author of a new book called All Else Failed, The Unlikely Volunteers at the Heart of the Migrant Aid Crisis. Dana Sachs joins me for the first time, and that begins at 46 minutes in. But before that, I've got a great conversation with our friend Bill Boyle, who is just back from Ireland, where the president is actually visiting right now. We talked a little bit about that visit, the leaked documents from the Pentagon, compromising sources and methods, and much more. The latest in the Ukraine war, Trump with Tucker Carlson, and much more. But first, I've got some news stories for you, as I tend to do here at the top of the show, Monday through Thursday. I mention the news, and then I have guests on that explain the news. We learn each and every day from those guests, so thank you very much for joining me here today on Stand Up. It's a daily podcast that if you could afford $5 for a month or more, many of you pay a lot more, that would be awesome because I can't do it without you. StandUpWithPete.com right now. And of course, it is Thursday, which means we will hang out tonight. So check out the Hangout link. If you're a subscriber, you'll get that in an email. If you're not getting it, let me know. StandUpWithPete@gmail.com. And I hope to see you tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern at the Stand Up Happy Hour Hangout that I host almost every Thursday. All right, here are some important stories from the last day of news. First and foremost, the EPA proposed tougher tailpipe emissions limits that could require up to 67% of new vehicles sold in the U.S. to be all electric by 2032. And I found this pretty good 2-minute recap from CBS News last night that I thought would be informative for you on that.
It's a massive jolt for electric vehicles. The EPA's proposed tailpipe pollution standards are so strict they would effectively force automakers to ditch most gas-powered cars and trucks and put the pedal to the metal on EVs.
Today's actions will accelerate our ongoing transition to a clean vehicles future.
Right now, fully electric vehicles make up just 7% of new car sales. The Biden administration is trying to supercharge that to more than half by 2030 and 2/3 by 2032. Major U.S. automakers are rapidly ramping up production of EVs, but there are concerns about the supply of raw materials for the batteries and whether the nation's power grid can handle charging demands.
And that's ultimately going to determine whether we can reach these levels.
John Bozzella represents the auto industry.
This is clearly ambitious. Is it realistic?
There's no question automakers know how to make electric vehicles. It's going to require a complete transformation of the automotive industrial base if we're going to be truly successful here.
Getting Americans to go electric is key to the Biden administration's climate goals. In the U.S., transportation is the largest contributor to planet-warming carbon emissions. But while 41% of Americans say they are very or somewhat likely to buy an EV, 47% say they are not, mostly because of the cost and lack of charging stations.
So charging stations like this one will eventually need to be on almost every corner, just like gas stations are today. The Biden administration says it wants a nationwide network of 500,000 chargers by 2030. But Nora, that's going to take a lot of work because that's about 4 times as many that currently exist.
Yeah, a lot of chargers. Ben Tracy, thank you so much.
Yeah, a lot of chargers. Ben Tracy, thanks so much. Yeah, no, they're not. They're not going to need to be on every corner because you're going to have one at your house. It was so amateurish right there. It was a real... No, not the case. Not the case. In urban areas, yes, they'll be more concentrated. But in urban and ex-urban and suburban, I don't even know what ex-urban means, you'll have your own charger like I have. By the way, I got my first plug-in hybrid in 2010. Early adapter over here, and most of you still haven't gotten your first. Get on it. By the way, I thought in a related story, I saw this from the New York Times, reporting from China, Keith Bradshaw. The headline is, Why China Could Dominate the Next Big Advance in Batteries. China far ahead of the rest of the world in the development of batteries that use sodium, which are starting to compete with ubiquitous lithium power cells. Now China's positioned itself to command the next big innovation in rechargeable batteries, replacing lithium with sodium, far cheaper and more abundant material. So I am going to read all about that. I'll have to reach out to David Roberts and talk to him about that. He runs Volts, his amazing outlet, which is all about renewable energy. Okay, so what else can I tell you? Do I need to tell you from yesterday? The Federal Reserve projected the nation's economy is going to fall into a mild recession by year's end. U.S. inflation fell to its lowest level in nearly 2 years, so that's pretty good news. Tim Scott officially launched his Presidential Exploratory Committee, the clearest sign yet of his intentions to run for the Republican ticket in 2024. In a video that stretched just over 3 minutes, Senator Scott repeatedly took aim at President Joe Biden and Democrats, vowing to stand up to China and secure the borders, give parents a choice at their children's education, protect religious liberty, whatever any of that means. He was savaged as a reaction from a whole bunch of... I'm just going to read some black folks responding to Tim Scott's announcement. First of all, he announced his campaign at Fort Sumter, and Keith Boykin writes, Tim Scott announcing his campaign at Fort Sumter was the site of the first battle of the Civil War is ridiculous when today's Republican Party is still celebrating the racist Confederate traitors who fought against the Union and would have kept him enslaved. Elie Mystal had a somewhat similar reaction when he wrote, There are many dumbass things about Tim Scott announcing his run for president at Fort Sumter, but one of the dumbest is that fort was never taken. After the Confederates took it, they held on to it for the duration of the Civil War, eventually abandoning but never surrendering. And the Speaker of the Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries' brother, Hassan Jeffries, who's been on the show, Professor Hassan Jeffries, writes, I can't be the only one wondering if Tim Scott would have been defending Fort Sumter alongside federal troops or attacking it with South Carolina enslavers. Shake my head. Tim Scott, of course, has zero chance of getting the Republican nomination, according to me, and I'm always right about such things. All right, moving on, I wanted to mention this. I thought this is pretty interesting from the Kaiser Family Foundation. A new survey. As gun violence continues its grim march across America, the scale of the crisis is becoming ever clearer. A new survey reports that this astonishing figure, 1 in 5 American adults, have had a family member killed by a gun. And that's not all. 1 in 6 Americans have witnessed a shooting. Among black adults, it's 1 in 3. Some of the findings from the Kaiser Family Foundation polling released this week amid the newest and most recent acts of violence. Of course, Monday, a gunman killed 5 people at a Kentucky bank. 2 weeks earlier, Nashville, Tennessee was the scene of a horrific school shooting that left 6 people dead, including 3 9-year-olds. The vast majority of American adults surveyed reported that they worry at least sometimes that they or someone they love is going to be involved in a violent gun attack. And also, in a related story, the last of the Tennessee legislators to be expelled from the Tennessee legislature, Justin Pearson, was reinstated yesterday, and outside the State House, he made this impassioned speech, which I wanted to include here for you. Justin Pearson, Tennessee, yesterday.
Waken a sleeping giant! They put Gloria Johnson and Justin Jones and me on trial. But they ended up putting themselves on trial. And the people's verdict is back.
There you go. Justin Pearson, after being reappointed to the Tennessee House, they tried to kill democracy. They tried to expel the people's choice and the people's vote, and they awakened a sleeping giant. Very, very accurate indeed. And that is all I've got for you at today's news, other than NPR quit Twitter and HBO is changing its name to Max, which Michael Cohen, our friend Michael Cohen, not the lawyer, Trump's former disgraced lawyer, is obsessed with. Why would you change your name from HBO, which is a well-respected brand, to something else at all, much less it be Max? So that's what I've got for you in today's news section. And now it's time to get to my guests, which is why I'm sure you came by. Coming up again, I've got this great writer for the first time, Dana Sachs. Her new book is fascinating and important about Migrant Aid Crisis, and she gets inside of it. She was there in Greece back in 2015 and 16, and it's just a spellbinding book. I really, really like it and her, and learn a lot from journalist, novelist, and Dana Sachs for the first time. But right now, it's time to get to our friend Bill Boyle. Bill Boyle is a longtime listener, turned caller, turned guest. He's got as much credibility as anybody because he just doesn't give a shit about the outcome. He's not trying to become a commentator. He's not trying to get clicks. He's not trying to make money. He just pays real close attention to what's happening in the world. He's very well connected down there in D.C., but he's a businessman. He owns parking garages. If you're looking for a place to park in Washington, D.C., he's your guy. But he's also our guy here on Stand Up, that we love having our own special correspondent who is just back from Ireland, where he went with some friends for a trip. Now the president is there. So we started by talking about Ireland, and then, of course, we talked about these leaked documents, which are really big deal, as well as some political stories and more. Always great conversation with Bill Boyle at Bill B in DC. Let's do it. There he is, Bill Boyle, and we haven't talked to him since you got back from Ireland, where our president currently is on a taxpayer-funded vacation. Hi. No.
Hi, how are you?
He was criticized. Is the president on a taxpayer-funded family reunion? Because I guess he brought his family with him.
I don't know. I mean, what horse shit that is. I mean, every single possible American president we're ever going to get, up to and including Obama, by the way, has relatives in Ireland. So there's no way it's not a family reunion for virtually any American president that we're likely to have.
I would almost be like, if you ran for president, I'm like, and if I get elected, I'm telling you right now, I'm taking my family to Ireland on Air Force One for a family reunion. Like, because I get to. I'd be like, I'm fine with that. You need to go there for business anyway. I'm fine with paying for your family. That's cool. It's cool. It's good for America for you to go to other countries.
It's great American politics. It's great politics in America. There are Irish people everywhere. I mean, and it totally fits in with everything that American politics loves, which is reconnecting back with the old country and having, some tie to the wider world. And to be honest with you, all very sort of traditional, right? I mean, there's nothing more traditional in American politics than getting, the shamrocks waved and beer waved at you in Ireland. So, yeah, if people critiquing him, they're morons because it's good politics.
How was your trip? What did you learn?
So the line that I've been repeating ad nauseum since I got back is that it was the most sobering drinking weekend I've ever been on in my entire life.
How so?
I'll send you some of the pictures if you want to connect them to this podcast. But Belfast is a place with really intense cleavages still. And if you're on the eastern side of the city, basically every main street is another neighborhood. Like it's Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Protestant. And when you get in the middle of West Belfast, between the Falls Road, the infamous Fall Roads, and the even more infamous Shankill Road, there is, I shit you not, a 55-foot wall that separates those neighborhoods. It goes for 4 miles. It has 6 gates that close at 7 p.m. every night and only reopen at 6 a.m. with security guards and cameras everywhere. It is like,
what are the cleavages? What are the lines? Protestant, Catholic,
really unionist and pro-republic. If you had a vote in Northern Ireland, there would not be a majority to join Ireland, but there wouldn't probably be much of a majority to stay in England either. There's this weird sort of thing happening where it's creating its own identity. And no one is particularly happy with, Ireland is expensive. It's in the EU. There are different rules. It's really going forward and has like higher taxes, that sort of thing. But if you stay in the UK, you're stuck in post-Brexit England where they can't get shit done and they're really bad at things like health service and all the rest. The poorest neighborhoods I've ever seen in Ireland, on the island of Ireland, were in the biggest city in Ireland, which is Belfast. And I mean, it's poor, like you're on the Shankill Road at 6 o'clock and everything except for the couple of Chinese restaurants and a couple of bars, everything's closing because it's dangerous at night. There's a lot of heroin, there's a lot of meth, there's a lot of other bad things there, and there's drug gangs everywhere. So, Belfast, by the way, downtown Belfast, other parts of it were beautiful. The people were awesome. The beer was excellent. The crack was amazing. They love American tourists because they don't get many. Really, they have a lot of joie de vivre because they're so involved in the potential for violence. They can see it. You walk down the street. I mean, Pete, where we have big banners of, if you're in New York and you see the big banners for a movie or for a Broadway show or whatever, in Belfast, that's to commemorate either a highly violent paramilitary or to commemorate a political prisoner who died in prison on a hunger strike. And by the way, it's not just the big stuff. You'll be walking down a street and there'll be plaques everywhere. Timmy O'Connelly was killed by the RUC on this date in 1992. No one was ever convicted. You walk 3 blocks, it's John Adams and Tim Scott were killed in an IRA drive-by. No one was ever arrested. I mean, like their hatreds, their bitterness, their history, it's memorialized everywhere you go. And very right in your face, no bullshit, no kidding around. I think in Belfast, probably about a third of the Catholics are really still have their knives in their back pocket. I think that's true of the same amount of Protestants. Everyone else just wants to either kind of ease their way through this or leave. It's a really, and by the way, the thing that struck me the most about Belfast was watching and realizing how this could be us if we keep going on the road we're going. Where if you really get to the point where you just decide the people who disagree with you politically, they're the other, and they are sort of the epitome of evil, and they're destroying civilization. And Northern Ireland identity is really set right up. People aren't alluding to it, or it's about identity. And if we live in a country that goes in that direction, be prepared for a country that is like living in the troubles in Northern Ireland.
Well, fair enough. Wanted to ask you, that sounds interesting. I could hear, a lot about your trip. I look forward to that at a hangout or in person at some point. Yeah. I want to hear more about your experience there. But I certainly want to ask you about the Pentagon's classified document leak and your takeaways and questions you have about that, and the latest in Ukraine, which certainly they're connected because there was some information about the fight there and thoughts on it. Looks like this was basically, it could have been the PDB, or it was Chairman, Chief of Joint Chief of Staff Milley's like briefs, like they were for him or something. Somehow they got out there. There's a lot of concern with how they might have escaped, and there's a lot of conversation. Anytime this happens, what are your thoughts on the damage that it's done, and basically what it all means?
So the first thing is that how it got out is fascinating. It got out from a bunch of trad Christian, slightly pro-Russian, sort of anti-American goofballs, mostly related to people who hung out on a Filipino Discord server talking about Minecraft. I mean, you couldn't make this shit up.
Yeah, like apparently these documents were published in some chat room, for lack of a better,
That's right.
For people who are older.
That's right.
Just some random space, a foreign country,
Yes.
in a niche chat room in a foreign country. They were up there, and they were up there maybe for a month before the United States government found
since
out.
October in some cases. Since October, the beginning. Now, the guy who put them up, from what I understand, he was arguing with these guys about Russia and about how the war in Ukraine was going. And I guess some of even these pro-Russian guys were saying, the Russians are getting the shit kicked out of them. And he, to try to impress them, was like, well, actually, here's some data, and started uploading these things. Now, the fact that he was doing it despite the fact, again, that it was in some random chat room. The fact that this guy was uploading things from October to March, it suggests quite a few things. I have my own little, identity kit for this guy, who I think he is. I think he's going to be an under 35 E5 guy working as a runner or a paper handler in some place where this briefing was being given, right? Physically in the world, doesn't matter where he was, although I would suggest he was not in the US. So you got this nerdy guy, almost certainly no girlfriend, who is working in an office in the paper flow of the Pentagon that is working on the war in Ukraine. Now, this was not the PDB, and this was not the most highly secret stuff in the world. It's not Snowden. That's bullshit when people tell you this is bigger than Snowden. It's way, way, way smaller. It's less than Reality Winner put out. Let me put it that way. What this is the Daily Brief.
A stunning leak of cash classified Pentagon documents appears to be one of the most significant breaches of U.S. intelligence in decades, purportedly revealing national security secrets regarding Ukraine, Russia, Asia, and the Middle East, as well as details about U.S. espionage methods and the country's spying on adversaries and allies. That's the New York Magazine.
Yeah, that's horseshit. Here's the thing. Most of the things, I read them. I found a high resolution, batch of them. Almost everything in there, Pete, are things that would not surprise you. Like, it tells you how many HIMARS missiles the Ukrainians have fired at Russia. Well, the Russians are getting hit with them. They've got a pretty good idea what number is that hit them. The Russians had a very good idea of how many missiles the Ukrainians had in their air defenses. They have a pretty good idea of how many missiles they've received since the war began. Russia can do the math on when they're going to run down the S-300 batteries, their air defense batteries. This stuff is, I put a thing on there, I forget what the specific, yet another example of a thing that we all kind of know that's showing up in this intel that everyone's going, oh my God, I can't believe this. Is it a shock to anybody that the U.S. is going to underestimate both Ukrainian force generation and their ability to launch an offensive? We've been doing that since day one. Like, seriously, it's the idea that this is like real revelatory stuff. I'm sure for some professional intelligence guys, there's nuggets in there that are worth a lot. But mostly what this stuff is embarrassing. And a good example is that they say to the Egyptian president is saying, we're going to make and give to the Russians 40,000 missiles. And here's the best part, and gunpowder. No one's used fucking gunpowder in 100 years. It's cordite. It's the accelerant you use for things. Is not called gunpowder and hasn't for a long time. General El-Sisi of Egypt was a fucking general. He doesn't call it gunpowder. So you see that and you go, that misuse of that word, maybe it's bad translation, I don't know. But you also see like 40,000 missiles these guys are going to produce. Do they have 40,000 they can get them? Are they going to suddenly turn their factories on 3 shifts a day? Are they going to be able to do any of that without the U.S. going, whoa, hold on. Who are those for? Right? Like, there's a lot of, in the same way that the dossier on Trump was full of some true things and full of a lot of bullshit things, this is going to be a similar thing. I mean, none of the things in here, I think, in the original version, because the Russians did step on later versions and try to change things. There's nothing in here that's intended to be a lie, but it's basically, here's all the intel we're getting.
Yeah, some of the documents circulated on social media have been doctored, for instance, to reduce the number of estimated Russian casualties in Ukraine and inflate Ukraine's estimated losses. But that disinformation effort appears to have been made after the documents were leaked. I thought that was so somebody went in and doctored these documents after they were leaked. I interrupted you, but I've just given you a little bit more color.
No, that's okay. They doctor them and they're like, classic GRU, like clumsy douchebags. They go and they take the Russian and say there's 6,000. And then they take the Ukrainian losses of 17,000 to make them like 71 or something. Just obvious dumb photoshopping. I'll tell you something you're not going to hear about this leak. If the numbers are correct for losses that are in there, what that suggests is that virtually the entire army that Russia came into Ukraine with in the beginning, its equivalent in number of men, is completely gone.
Wow.
The Russians came in with 190, 180,000 men. the equivalent of that army is now completely evaporated. So there's things you can look at those and go, oh my God, these big secrets and terrible things that, we shouldn't know about. That again is something we kind of knew. Now we really know. So the bottom line is this: there are no huge revelations in here. There are embarrassments. It's embarrassing that some dope trying to impress his incel friends on some Filipino Discord called Thug Shaker actually ruined his own life by showing this stuff to them to impress them. And by the way, his life is ruined because if you look on those documents, printers in these offices put markings on every document so that they can very specifically say where it was printed and at what time. Those documents basically have, and even more so because they were done on more than one occasion, they're going to go look at who was in that office on the days these things were printed, and the 10,000 people that they might have to have looked at before is going to be 120. So the guy who did this is pretty properly fucked, and it's going to happen soon.
I feel like you're downplaying some of the issues here, such as the U.S. seen spying on top allies, including Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, South Korean leadership. Also showed some methods as to they appear
what methods did they show?
Well, not
I didn't
methods,
see a single.
Among other secrets, they appear to reveal where the CIA has recruited human agents privy to the closed-door conversations of world leaders. Eavesdropping that shows a Russian mercenary outfit tried to acquire weapons from NATO ally used. Like it compromises. Right. It compromises sources and to some extent methods because you can reverse engineer. I mean, how did they know this person? Or it must have been this person, and then they shut down that channel that was proving to be a very reliable source. That's damage. It's real damage.
I would tell you this. If you read those things carefully, you realize that almost all of the intelligence gathered was signals intelligence. Us listening into them. That is the deal. And by the way, I would be hesitant to believe the exact description of the source that you would see in a document with that much distribution. 5,000 people a day see that document.
Yeah.
I would be highly, highly surprised, more surprised than you'd imagine, if it turns out that each thing is specifically delineated to how they got the info. The guys in the Pentagon war planning don't need to know that, right? And so I suspect strongly that there's less of a trail there than people imagine. Of course, there will be some damage. Of course. If nothing else, by the way, they're just going to try to shut everything down because they're going to not know where exactly it came from. So it will hurt us a little bit. As far as us spying on our allies, let me tell you a story about South Korea. Everybody that I know that works for the U.S. government, when they go to South Korea, are a very good ally, and we are a tight, good ally with South Korea. They never bring their phone. If you're on a Codel, you get a phone provided to you by the federal government that is a clean phone. And you know what they do with that phone when you get back? They immediately take it from you, and they harvest all of the software that the Koreans managed to put on it while you were in their country. Allies spy on each other. They spy on us. We spy on them. Nobody spies more than the French or the Israelis, for that matter. And you know what? That kind of spying is good. Because when you spy on your allies, you know what they're doing. You know what they're thinking. You're not having to depend on the statement from the LCA Palace or something. You know what's going on. And again, allies are going to hold back from each other for various reasons, not all bad reasons. The spying against allies, it's okay. It's okay. I don't even, and honestly, I would laugh if anybody acted like, oh, they're getting the vapors. Oh my God, the French are spying on us. We're spying on them. Oh dear.
Right.
I mean, it's bullshit. When you read that in a newspaper article about all this, just underline that author's name and write hack, because they're not telling you something that they already know is bullshit, or they are telling you something that they already know is bullshit. Nobody in the world is not spying on everyone else. If they're not spying on everyone else, they're just doing it better so you can't tell.
Right. Okay, let me ask you about the latest in Ukraine. It looks like the defense of Bakhmut is not looking good for the Ukrainians. They're cornered in a small part of the city, and it looks like a really bad situation. A lot of very close firefights. I was just reading about it today. And you can tell me the rest and your thoughts on it as you follow it day to day.
So the Russians decided to try to win the war, or at least try to win the optics of the war for this winter in Bakhmut. It is now middle of April. They haven't taken Bakhmut. The losses they took trying to take Bakhmut, probably on the range of 3-1 to what the Ukrainians took. The fight in Bakhmut, did it stop the Ukrainians from generating, as far as I can tell, something like 3 divisions of offensive troops for the spring? It didn't stop that either. Did Bakhmut create opportunities anywhere else on the front for the Russians? Did it thin the Ukrainians out anywhere so that they could take other land back? No, it didn't. So the Russians poured all their excess ammunition. They poured a lot of their excess mobilization. They poured all of Wagner Group. Wagner Group is basically destroyed right now, into a city that had little to no strategic value. And did a bunch of Ukrainians get killed there? Very definitely. I think you're looking at 8,000 to 10,000 Ukrainian casualties there versus something like 50 for the Russians. Right? And that is an extremely good exchange for Ukraine. It's totally worth it. Bakhmut, again, does not have any significance strategically for Ukraine, except in this. If the Ukrainians could keep the Russians attacking them there and keep just letting them run into a wall there, then you're using up Russian offensive power in the worst possible place for them. So why not? Keep them doing it, keep fighting. I mean, the Ukrainians didn't intend on fighting for Bakhmut, really, at first. They decided to keep it going when they realized how idiotic the Russians were in trying to take it. And when your enemy decides to keep stepping on his own dick, Pete, you get out of the way and say, go for it, all yours. And so Bakhmut is not it's not important in the way that Stalingrad was not important. What it was good for was to let the enemy exhaust himself. And that's what the Ukrainians did. I think they did it successfully. And, as I just alluded to, if you look at what's coming, the Ukrainians probably have 40 to 50, maybe 60,000 men available for an offensive. They are getting tons and tons and tons of Western equipment. Have you seen a German or a British tank exploded on a single Russian video yet anywhere?
I mean, I wouldn't. I don't spend my time watching those videos, much less discerning what's Russian.
Right.
But so I can't.
Nobody has. All that aid, all those armored vehicles, strikers, and everything else. No one has seen them on the battlefield yet. The Ukrainians are building up an offense. Whether it will be successful or not, we'll see. But Russia right now is facing that once the mud dries, they're facing a highly more mobile Ukrainian offensive force than they've ever faced before. And they're not thick on the ground because they used up so many men trying to take Bakhmut. I suspect what you're going to see is an attempt by the Ukrainians to break through somewhere in Zaporizhzhia and get down to the beginning of the peninsula in Crimea. And I won't really be more specific than that, although I have pretty strong ideas about how they're going to do it. But I think the idea is going to be to cut off Crimea in the north and take back, not quite Mariupol, but get close enough on that southern front so that there's no longer a land bridge to Crimea and that they can break the Kerch Bridge. Because if Ukraine can knock the bridge off to Crimea and cut off Crimea from the rest of the Russian army, Crimea is then Kherson times 10. You'll have 70,000 Russian troops there that can't be supplied well. And then I think that is the strategic fulcrum point of this war. If the Ukrainians can cut off Crimea and kick the Russians back in the southern front, then Russia's almost exactly back to where it began. And, at that point, we'll have had 250,000 casualties to show for it, and a Ukrainian military that keeps on getting stronger, that with less to defend and more easy things to attack. So I think that's what we're heading for. Knock on wood, you're going to see the Crimean army in the northern end of the Crimean Peninsula and in Mariupol by the end of the summer. And if that happens, I think the war's over.
if you're right, and we'll check in at the end of the summer, I know you'll hold me to it. We'll give you a major credibility award. Before,
just send me like a 6-pack of Bud. What's the one they're running over it right now? Anheuser-Busch. Anything by Anheuser-Busch.
Bud Light.
Yeah, send me a 6-pack of that.
They're standing with the trans community, so I guess it's bad.
Yeah, I want the trans can, like the rainbow can. Don't just send me any Anheuser-Busch.
You actually were shooting Bud Light cans long before they identified as in solidarity with trans people because of the product itself.
Yeah, I was doing that because it was shitty beer, not because it was
right.
The best thing about Anheuser-Busch beer is that they're pro-trans. Like in every other way, they totally suck.
What do you want to say? I know you want to say something about Matt Taibbi and Elon Musk parting ways. What I had to get your reaction to that. You've been the OG hater of Elon Musk, and of course, we've all turned sour on our old friend Matt Taibbi. What about the fact that they now are at odds? I don't know if I need to explain this story. So just give me your reaction to that.
So the thing that blows me away about that is that it's obvious that anyone who puts their credibility on the line for a completely inhuman, bizarre, incel-loving billionaire like Elon Musk is going to lose every ounce of credibility sooner or later when they do. And it strikes me in like as a amazing thing that Matt Taibbi, who I always thought was a clown and I always thought was a blowhard. But like the Mr. Gonzo journalist couldn't see that is just amazing to me. And what happened is that the minute that Elon Musk had no longer any use for Matt Taibbi, just crumpled him up in a ball and threw him in the fucking garbage. I mean, just wild. And to see these guys sort of act with shock is really amazing because it tells you how disconnected people become from sort of A, how the world works, but B, that the world would kind of work that way for them. They assume that because they sidle up to this billionaire that, they're now one of the boys and they're now in that league. And, I think Matt Taibbi was looking at all the money he was making from all the clicks he was getting from being associated with Musk and making a ton of money on Substack through that. And I think he really it was sort of, God, it's these Me Too men's rights douchebags who always fall for this stuff. They worship power in a way. And for somebody like Taibbi, I think it was the power to be able to say, yeah, you Me Too'd me, but fuck you, look at me now.
Yeah.
And of course, he flew too close to the douchebag son that is Elon Musk and his wings got burned. And now we're getting to watch him slowly spiral down into the sea, right? I mean, really just amazing. And it amazes me that these guys have so little wisdom, so little perspective, and so little respect for themselves. I mean, if you really want me to get wild about it, to me, I always say that to have fascism, there's never enough fascists. There's only just enough opportunists. That's what you need, right? And we're really seeing in this era, guys like Matt Taibbi, who they will suck right up to someone who's effectively a fascist because it makes them feel big, right? I mean, that's fascism at its core. It makes you feel big, and you feel like you're an oppressed class, and now you're going to feel like a big guy. Matt Taibbi, scion of a major guy at ABC News, went to Bard College, played college basketball, a privileged motherfucker. And yet that guy felt like the world was oppressing him. And now he's paying, so he did that thing of I'm going to run to the other big guy and we're going to feel like big boys now and fuck you all. And it turned out that was all bullshit. He was being used he was craving power and being used by someone who actually has some.
That is a really interesting and hard to disagree with psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I mean, it's that. Let that be put upon his gravestone, because that is who he is.
One more psychoanalysis. I was talking with Zatz today. Zatz is my buddy who I hike with every Wednesday, and at some point during our hike, we get to politics. And I said to him, and now to you,
What is that? How do you analyze Trump sitting down with Tucker Carlson? Before we get to the clip that you shared, made me want to vomit, that a lot of people may have seen if they can stomach watching him really canonizing the world's worst dictators, Putin, Xi, and who else? And I think Kim Jong-un. They're tops. They're powerful. They're very good, top of the game. But Trump knows what Tucker Carlson said about him on those leaked calls. He knows that Tucker said all kinds of terrible things about him. And he sat down with Tucker Carlson, and it didn't come up. I'm pretty sure. Maybe it did. I don't think it did. But the point is, Tucker gets huge ratings by having Trump, and Trump gets the biggest platform. But that wouldn't happen in almost any other genre. It certainly would never happen with Barack Obama and Rachel Maddow. It would never happen on, I'm not even going to say the progressive left, the mainstream centrist corporate media. If John Carl of ABC News texted somebody that he absolutely hates Joe Biden would never sit down with him, no matter how big his play. It just would never happen. And so I was looking at that and trying to, psychoanalyze two men that hate each other, but mutually have a mutual benefit from talking to each other on tape. And I don't know what else to think about it, but it was just you would never see that anywhere else. Only these two cats or those like them.
Not just those two, though. Not just those two, because Trump
those like them. I mean, it's a very, I can't, maybe there's other examples outside of politics or something. I don't know.
There's a great example, the Nazi-Soviet pact, right? I mean, the Russians, Stalin and Hitler allied before World War II. And the reason I bring that up is it really describes what's happening here on the small scale, which is that these guys derive benefit for themselves from doing it, and that's all that matters. Joe Biden has a set of morals and a set of ideological impulses. John Carl does. Rachel Maddow does. Shit, Brett Baer kind of does. Most of these, a little bit. Most people who are not part of the right wing right now, their motivations are different. They actually have policies they want to enact. They have things that are core values. They have a self-image, by the way, that is defined by not being a weird suck up. Whereas somebody like Tucker Carlson and most of the people in that media sphere, they're defined by, they'll say anything. Look at Will fucking Cain. Great example. We both know Will Cain. Will Cain, by all of my experience with him years ago, talking to him on your show, super nice guy. You watch Will McCain now, just fucking Kafka-esque metamorphosis into an enormous cockroach. Says whatever he can to do to make sure that he is going to be on Fox as long as possible, collecting that check and being famous. And that's who these people are. And I hate to tell you, that's exactly what happened to Will Cain too.
Well said. Thank you very much, as always, for there's so much more to talk about, but I want to get this up tonight.
Sure.
And we'll talk again really soon about Trump's legal issues and anything else.
Yeah. One last thing. Definitely a DOJ indictment, is coming, and definitely a Georgia indictment is coming. And they're both going to be broader by a lot than the one in New York. Yeah.
Do you think have any idea of timelines on them?
I think Georgia could happen any week in the next month and a half. And I think DOJ will probably they're still interviewing people. They just finished basically another month or 2, 3. But I just don't see how they cannot. And Bragg very happily got rid of the first mover problem.
Yeah.
So there were no riots. The country didn't fall apart.
Yeah.
Trump supporters.
There were a lot of people who were crying in the courthouse.
Exactly. Large men were crying. Yes. So I think that Trump's numbers are going to get, by the way, more and more people as this has gone on think he A, shouldn't run, and B, probably legitimately indicted. It's over 50%. So the more hits that keep coming, I think, and by the way, I think Trump stays in because he'll still have 40% of the GOP, but it's going to get pretty harsh on the legal team at Mar-a-Lago. So
there you go. Bill Boyle, Thank you very much.
All right, there you go. Bill Boyle at the Bill B in D.C. Tell him you heard him. Argue with him. Let him know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you think about his comments and thoughts. As always, great. Love talking to Bill. And we continue to have a great conversation, personal conversation after I hit stop. And just such a good friend of mine and such a great guy. And always love talking to him. So getting his perspective is great. I hope he's right about the war in Ukraine. And now it's time to get to my second guest of today's show. I've told you a little bit about her already, but here it is. In 2015, increasing numbers of refugees and migrants, most of them fleeing war-torn homelands, arrived by boat on the shores of Greece, setting up the greatest displacement in Europe since World War II. As journalists reported horrific mass drownings, an ill-prepared and seemingly indifferent world looked on. Those who reached Europe needed food, clothing, medicine, and shelter, but the international aid system broke down completely. All else failed as Dana Sachs' compelling eyewitness account of the successes and failures of the volunteer relief network that emerged to meet the enormous need. Closely following the odysseys of 7 individual men and women and their families, it tells a story of despair and resilience, revealing the humanity within an immense humanitarian disaster. She's a journalist and novelist and co-founder of the nonprofit Humanity Now, Direct Refugee Relief, which supports grassroots teams for providing aid to displaced people. She lives in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I'm very happy to welcome her to stand up for the very first time, the author of All Else Failed, The Unlikely Volunteers at the Heart of the Migrant Aid Crisis. Welcome, Dana Sachs.
Okay, Dana Sachs is joining me now, and for the first time, and I can't believe it's the first time that we've ever talked, but her new book is out, All Else Failed, The Unlikely Volunteers at the Heart of the Migrant Aid Crisis. Dana, welcome to Stand Up. I'm so happy to talk to you today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
We want to learn about you, though, before we get into this amazing book and what you covered and what you experienced. You've been writing about this and immersing yourselves in refugee crises around the world and understanding them for a very long time. Who are you? Why do you do this?
I'm a curious person. I love to travel. I mean, I can't say, oh, I decided at this certain point in my life I'm going to do this and this and this. I just keep following what's interesting to me. And I spent a lot of time in Vietnam. And of course, Vietnam has had its own refugee situations. And I think that work and the books that I wrote about that led me to think a lot about displacement. And so it was kind of a natural thing once I became interested in what was going on in the refugee situation in Greece to try to understand that too. It's just been something that's been very compelling to me forever.
Who were you when you were a little girl and a young woman? Did you have a direction in your life that you were aiming? This is a little bit of a selfish question because my daughter's a high school senior and off to college, and you think about everything that they might do, and you've done this amazing thing for humanity, and I wonder what makes you tick. Like what brought you to that?
Well, I mean, I think intellectually for me, it's been finding the thing that I'm really passionate about, and I do love writing. And so writing is kind of the through line. It's my way of responding to experiences I have. I mean, I remember after I graduated from college, maybe a few years after that, I went traveling, backpacking in Asia for, 8 or 9 months. And I got to a point where it was just, I was absorbing too much and I wasn't able to respond to it in any way. So I went home. And I mean, it was amazing and it changed my life. But I also thought, I can't just kind of travel and experience things without being able to try to figure out what it means for me. And so through the writing, I'm able to do that.
And you've written everything. You've done all type of writing, fiction, nonfiction, journalism, really everything that can be done as a writer. It seems like you have made.
But it's all storytelling. It really is. People ask me sometimes, they're saying like, what's the difference between writing nonfiction and fiction? And my nonfiction is not academic. My nonfiction is, I don't call it a nonfiction novel, but it's very novel. It's always very novelistic and characters, and there's kind of a plot development, and there's, I think it speaks to the same thing in the reader, this desire to know what happens and to find out more about individuals. So it appeals to me in that way.
I'll ask you to explain a little bit, given that, about your new book in a moment. But before, I still have to get to how you got to, and I'm starting to piece it together, and I've done my homework, but how you got to working with displaced people, refugee crisis. You mentioned, of course, Vietnam. You wrote a book about that. But I mean, what was it that brought you to this? Because my point that I'm driving at is most people don't want to walk into a refugee camp once they've read a little bit about what goes on in refugee camps or what it's like in refugee camps. It's not a great place to be. And yet you went to them all over the planet. You've written about them. You've covered these crises. What was your first experience? Why that?
My first experience in a refugee camp was in Thailand when I was writing about some issues with Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, and I went to a refugee camp there, and it was quite different from the ones I describe in Greece because it was a refugee camp that was almost like a city, like a permanent city. People had been there. I think it was going on like the second generation of people. So it was established. There were little cafes and, markets. That is not what the refugee camps look like that I go to in Greece. The ones in Greece are much more temporary and not established. They're pretty miserable. Not to say that the one in Thailand wasn't miserable, but I would say for me that I find them to be extremely compelling places because people are experiencing something that is profound. And I mean, there's several parts of me that's drawn to that. One is the desire to help and to get involved and see what I can do to help the situation. And the other is that in your interactions with people there, you can learn a lot. And as a writer, I hope I can sort of try to help translate their experience to something that readers in other places can understand. And I really want to humanize refugees. I would say that that's one of the most important things to me. They can do that for themselves as well, and they need to have a platform to do that. But to the extent that I can do that, I want to help show that they're just the same as us. They just are in a very displaced or unstable situation. They're in a period of transformation from whatever they were before they became refugees to whatever they'll be next. And that's a very dynamic moment in their lives. And to be able to interact with people when they're going through that is an honor, really.
Yeah, let me just ask you one personal question and we'll get to the book. But doing this work, somewhat personal, doing this work, I can imagine gives you great purpose. Of course, you're a great writer and you love to write. And so you love to be able to do and make a living doing what you do. But you've also co-founded this nonprofit organization, and you've been in these camps with these people. And so now everybody everywhere is talking about life and happiness and suffering and productivity and you name it on a million different shows. And when I talk to someone like you, I have to imagine and wonder about how you see your own life and what you've done for a living. And the personal question is what that does for you on a day-to-day basis.
Well, that's a deep question. That's a difficult question, but one that it sort of makes me emotional just hearing it because, I mean, the truth is I am passionate about writing. I love it. It like turns on something in my brain that nothing else turns on. It's stimulating to me, but it is at a distance. And I didn't expect to be involved with starting a nonprofit. I expected to sort of try to write about this place, but I did when I went over. So I went to Greece the first time because a friend of mine who works with refugees in the United States decided to go and volunteer in Greece because there was, as we'll talk about more, a grassroots aid movement that had begun in response to the fact that the mainstream traditional aid organizations that you expect to be there in times of crisis weren't really there. And so all these individuals just went to Greece or were already in Greece and started handing out sandwiches and food and water and trying to help in whatever way that they could. So my friend was going over there and she said, she started telling me about it. And I said, oh, that sounds really interesting. Can I go with you? And so we went and we were only there for like 10 days. And it felt to me like a little bit weird to fly all the way to Greece to help for 10 days. How much good could I do? Really? Handing out soup, like, wouldn't it be better to send money? And I said that to her and she said, well, let's collect money. And it was really amazing. The first time we went, we just told our friends we were going and we raised $20,000. So then suddenly we became funders. and we had to talk to people and figure out how to best spend this money so that it would be the most effective. And I loved that. And it was so connected and involved in a way that writing isn't. So that was in 2016. And I've continued to do that. Eventually, with 3 friends, formed this nonprofit. And what we do is the exact same thing. We raise money here in the United States, and we use it to fund small grassroots aid teams that are helping refugees. And it's all volunteer. So 100% of the money that we raise goes to the projects that we support. So that's an important thing I need to say.
That's really wonderful. I'd like to talk to you more about that at some point. Humanity Now, Direct Refugee Relief, supports grassroots teams providing aid to displaced people. Okay, amazing. I love that answer, and I appreciate you sharing that with me, because I think, I don't know, I often think about that with everybody, like what drives you, what's your purpose. I love doing this so much, getting the opportunity to talk to folks like you and connecting to the people who listen to the show and creating this community. That's definitely enough for me work-wise, if you can keep the heat on. But your book is about a pretty crazy time. How many years ago now? 8 years ago, I think.
Well, it's still continuing, but sure. Yeah. The story begins like in 2015, 2016, and it's unfortunately still a problem.
Yeah, you write, just very briefly, you write in the beginning of the book, how did all these asylum seekers end up living in an abandoned school in Athens, aided by volunteers, not by the European Union, the United Nations, or the world's vast network of non-governmental aid organizations? The answer lies in extraordinary geopolitical drama that had begun to rage in Europe the previous year. You write, as violence swept across much of the Middle East, hundreds of thousands of refugees fled their homelands, reached Turkey, and crossed the Aegean Sea into Greece. Once there, almost all continued north through the Balkans, then fanned out across Europe. By the end of 2015, some 800,000 had taken this route. It was the largest movement of displaced people in Europe since World War II. And of course, now we've got Ukraine, we've got our southern border. It's happening around the world, and we can talk about why. But we're talking in this book about that time that is, as you say, still continuing. And take it from there about how you then write this book and who you covered, because it's really wonderful the way you do it and how it starts with these 2 women.
Well, I felt like it's really easy when we're here in the United States to see these crises from a distance. And the photographs that we see in the media are often of people being basically like wearing rags or carrying nothing but a little plastic bag full of a few things. And when you see people in situations like that, I think compassion is not very difficult to call up, but empathy and a sense of the fact that could be us is more difficult.
Oh, yeah.
Because I live in my house, I have my car, I have so much stuff. And to see someone with a plastic bag that's carrying everything they have in a plastic bag, that is not me. So in my book, what I'm trying to do, for one thing, is to show that the people involved in this crisis are us. So the people who are the volunteers are people just like us. They're people who saw the problem and decided they wanted to go and help. And the people who are the refugees that I describe in the book, and all these refugees, by the way, become volunteers. They become part of this aid effort. They sort of step forward to help themselves in their own communities. But these refugees too, when I tell their stories and, describe their lives in Syria, for example, I talk about a woman named Rima who ends up traveling with 5 children by herself out of Syria, almost gets killed, through Turkey on a boat, ends up in camps, desperate. But when you go back far enough, she's just like us. She's a housewife in a small town outside of Aleppo. She loves organic cosmetics. She makes face masks with yogurt and rose water that she puts on her face and her children. And she has a nice house and she's a socialite. That's me. That's my friends and family. Sure. And the only difference is that a war came to where she was. And so I want to tell these stories. And like I said, as a writer, it's really important to me to tell a story that's compelling to read. And so what I did was I spent a lot of time over years interviewing all these different people and then try to weave their stories together so that world becomes something that we can understand and sort of feel closer to.
You do such a great job of it. It's hard to do an interview about a book like this because you just want to be like, well, just read it. We can't talk about it. You just got to read it because you introduce us to so many interesting people. So I feel like the best thing to do at this point in our conversation to share with people what this book is like is for you to just talk about these people. You just mentioned Rima, who ends up becoming a cook, and other people are taking care of and playing with her babies, and everybody gets these roles. I mean, a refugee camp is a social experiment, if I were to be so insensitive. I don't know how any other way to explain it thoughtfully.
Put it. Yeah.
But it's amazing how people develop, what roles they take and what pursuits and what purpose they give. And the people who end up, committing crimes and assaulting women and horrible things happen, obviously, as well, because we're humans living in squalor. But tell me about, say, I don't know, Tracy and Jenny, who were the volunteers, and more importantly, obviously, the people who they were helping.
So Tracy is a British woman from Northern England, and Jenny was her girlfriend, and they got to know. They met in New Zealand, and they became a couple. But then eventually they broke up. But they stayed friends, and Jenny decided when she read about the refugee crisis in Greece that she was going to go over there and try to help, because Jenny's a sort of Jill of all trades. She can rebuild a car. She can do almost anything with her hands. And she thought, I think my skills will be useful there. So she went over there, and Tracy said, well, I'm going to go over and just help you for a week or two. But they got there, and there were boats arriving, like boat after boat after boat, these small rubber dinghies arriving on the shores of Lesbos Island in Greece every day. And the people came off these boats, and like I said, they have nothing. And there's really no humanitarian aid response in place there. So all these individuals got together and formed these little aid teams and started doing things like beach rescue to help people off the boats when the boats come in, or giving out food, or taking care of people's children, or handing out blankets. And the very first scene of, in chapter 1 of the book is Tracy and Jenny standing on a beach, seeing a boat start to sink, and the people in the boat are coming out of the boat and starting to drown, and they run out to the water and they start pulling people in, and they save some people who would have drowned. And then at the end, Tracy's sort of like trying to figure out what that means. She's just a person like you or me who she went there to see what she could do to help. And she's finding herself literally saving lives. And she's like, I should not be the person doing this. Why am I the person doing this? But there's no one else there. And she feels like if I leave, then people will drown. So I'll stay. So she thought she would stay for a couple of weeks, and she ended up staying like 2 years.
I want to tell her, many years from now, you will be sitting somewhere and you'll be thinking about what you did with your life. And we will wonder why you sold out and went to work at a hedge fund, Tracy. No. She's like, I saved refugees from drowning. Now I'm going to go work for a bullet factory. I mean, I just can't imagine how that experience shaped her. I mean, you talk about it. You help us learn how these experiences shaped people. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about reading it. I do have to ask you just kind of a policy question. I think a lot of people are probably wondering, if they didn't follow the crisis then or now or any other refugee crisis, but specifically this one, what happened? Why did the NGOs fail? Where did the UN fail? Where did the EU fail? Where did Africa, Northern Africa? Obviously, we know to some extent what happened in Syria. It was just a brutal and horrific war. Yeah. And how did this end up this way to create this migrant crisis?
There's not any single answer, but there are a lot of answers that contribute to the facts of the situation, which is that in 2015 and 2016, there was not a viable international response in place to take care of these people as they arrived. So I'll tell you a couple of reasons. One is that this was taking place in Europe. So the United Nations and some of these other organizations, we read about them helping in war zones, or we read about them helping in countries that are, desperately poor, famine. They don't operate normally in Europe. I mean, now with the war in Ukraine, of course, it's different. But at that point, they weren't set up to do that. And they thought that, and reasonably so, that the European Union, which is extremely wealthy compared to other parts of the world, could and should be able to take care of itself. But that wasn't really happening either, in part because the European Union didn't want to encourage more people to come. So there's a deterrent, right. There's an interest in deterrence. And if you make it too cozy, if it seems like people are going to arrive and be put in really nice hotels, then the idea was you'll be encouraging all the other refugees in Turkey to get on a boat. So there's a lot of different aspects that worked against providing a viable response.
Right. A lot of different aspects that we can talk more about, that we can see play out. You write a lot about those grassroots volunteers, obviously, though, that made a huge difference, and those living in the camps. Talk to me about Greece and what it was like there, and how they found and took shelter, and people took roles. And I mean, it's just so visceral. Your writing is so wonderful, and I've just been immersed in it for the last 2 days, reading and thinking about what this must be like, and then trying to figure out how can I possibly share this, communicate this to a listener on a podcast. So good luck.
Thanks.
Yeah, I don't mean to be intimidated. I mean, like, it's just the writing. I'm sorry I said it that way. The writing is so great, and the situation is so great, and like, people have to read it, but pick up wherever you want, I guess.
I think what this book tells is a story about a community that develops unexpectedly when everything else went wrong. Suddenly people kind of reached into whatever their hearts or their practical skills, and they found ways that they could help. And I really, when I talk about Greece, I am often quite critical of the Greek government, because the Greek government was basically just trying to do the minimal in a lot of ways. But the Greek people, they were the first responders. They were the ones who were there from the very first minute, and many of them are continuing. It has changed their lives. So I'm trying to tell the story of how, when a crisis comes to a community, how people respond. And that story we could see it in New Orleans after the Hurricane Katrina, or we could see it now in parts of Eastern Ukraine, where people are mustering like incredible, like, emotional resources to be able to help each other. And I think that it's important to me to say that disaster brings out the worst in people, but it also brings out the best in people. And I find this story really hopeful. I mean, I think that's one of the main reasons I wanted to tell it, is because I mean, there's a lot of trauma. I'm not trying to say that there's not, but it is inspiring to see what people are capable of and the ways that they can work together with almost nothing to help each other. So I feel inspired by it. I mean, not to say it's not complex, again, and people, like you said, there's situations I write about where, it's not a utopia in that school that became a housing accommodation. There's a lot of problems. There's sexual harassment of women. I mean, it's disappointing in some really important ways. But the fact that that place existed and that it provided a home for 400 refugees when there was nowhere else for them to be is also a really important thing for us to remember.
Yeah, it really is. This book is about, in many ways, the helpers.
Yes, exactly.
That Mr. Rogers, I like to think about, talked about. Always look for the helpers, and you look for them and you find them. You were one of them, and you documented it in this book. But yet you do obviously mention the traumas. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, you were talking about Tracy and Jenny, and maybe them looking back 60 years from now and saying, I did this. But being in that situation and literally seeing people drowning is a trauma. So the refugees bring their trauma of losing their homes and, their communities, so many aspects of their lives, and literally quite often losing family members that they loved. And the many of the volunteers experience trauma by being a part of that, and by the sense of you're trying to help, but you can't solve this problem.
Yeah. And
that, I think a lot of them have suffered from that sense of like, why couldn't I do more? And you see that in my book. Like, I'm trying, but it's always the minimal amount. It's never enough. And that can be really emotionally painful and wear people down as well.
Yeah, I can only imagine thinking I've heard this from a lot of veterans. I haven't talked to as many aid workers or people who have responded like you read about, but you wonder about the people that you did help or that you couldn't help. What could have been? How did things turn out for that family in Iraq or Afghanistan? I've heard so many veterans, and a lot of them then deal with moral injury as a result of those experiences, which can lead to obviously taking your own life. And I mean, it can be. Yes, you articulated it perfectly well. Talk to me about the roles that people played in these camps. I'm really fascinated by that. I could see a screenplay. I could see your book being optioned into a film. I mean, because people take roles. Disciplinarian, cook, carpenter. Watching caretaker. Talk to me about how you saw that form and how that works. It sounds very much like anarchy, and yet it's not necessarily so.
I'll give you a story about Jenny, who I said was like a Jill of all trades. She can do anything with her hands. She created a very small aid team that was all volunteer run called the Get Shit Done team in northern Greece. After the Greek government started opening what they called official camps, but they built these camps in places that nobody else would want to get close to, like a shut down tanning factory. So I guess that's something to do with like leather, a toilet paper factory that was derelict. All these old buildings that had holes in them and were the plumbing, there was no plumbing or there was no electricity or very little. So anyway, there was a camp called Softex camp outside of the city of Thessaloniki that had hundreds of people living in it. Some of them living inside this old warehouse, and some of them living outside in tents, all in tents, but the inside the warehouse at least had a little bit of a roof over their head. But these buildings are falling down. And so they had an extreme mosquito problem in the building because it was an old warehouse that had no glass, nothing, no doors. And so there were just these huge window openings that were letting all these mosquitoes in, and a creek outside that had trash in it. So the mosquitoes were breeding, and children were ending up in the hospital. So Jenny saw this and she said, okay, I'm going to fix this problem. I mean, to even think you can fix the problem takes a certain amount of confidence. So she and her team, they got mosquito, the netting, and they went all the way around the building, standing on ladders, filling in the gaps in these windows, huge windows and doorways that you could drive a truck through. And they put mosquito netting everywhere. And in the beginning, the people who lived in the warehouse, the residents, these refugees, they kept watching. They were just watching her and they were saying, no good, no good. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. And then she just kept doing it. And little by little, the mosquito population began to plummet. And the children weren't scratching themselves anymore. And then the people that lived in there, they saw this, and I think it must have given them some hope. And they went out to the stream and started clearing this trash from the stream to make it run again so it wouldn't keep breeding mosquitoes. And I don't want to make it sound like, oh, what a perfect story, because there were people stealing her tools. The children were children often in these situations are really, they have trauma themselves. They were trying to push down the ladders. She had to deal with a lot of complicated stuff, but it worked. I mean, it didn't make the place livable. It was still a horrible place, but she dealt with this mosquito population. And then that was inspiring, I think, to other people to try to get involved and do other things to make the situation better.
You keep in touch with them?
I do, yeah. I keep in touch. There's 7 individuals and families that are sort of the main stories that I tell in the book, and I keep in touch with all of them. In fact, one family, I sort of follow them all the way from Syria, and then they ended up in Germany, and I just went and visited them in Germany, their new apartment in Bavaria a few weeks ago. I visited them a couple of times. So yeah, I mean, these people have added a lot to my life for sure, having those relationships.
I just wanted to ask you about your thoughts, given the fact that you've written so much, obviously, about the Vietnam refugee crisis. You've written 2 books related to that, and obviously you're a journalist, and you've been covering these refugee crises. You got the nonprofit. Earlier, I mentioned, of course, what's happened in Ukraine. Of course, what's happened in our southern border. People trying to get out of Central America, and you just have to wonder about how these are different from each other, any of them, in history. And it would seem that in Europe, in Greece, and in Italy, where my wife's family's in Sicily, and we've read and heard a lot about that, they seem to be not always so welcoming to many of these folks. In America, we're not so welcoming. I should say, we're brutally cruel, many of us, and they are as well in Europe. And then you see Ukraine, and it seems like they're being more welcomed in Europe. And you can't help but wonder that if we just are so tribal that we see people that look different or maybe worship different or have really different cultures than us, and we're just not welcoming to them. And it would seem like a majority of Europe has not been welcoming, and you've seen the governments change. And I wonder what you think about the kind of geopolitics of who we welcome and who we don't now or in the past.
Yeah. I mean, when the war in Ukraine started, one of the things that was really obvious was the difference in terms of welcome between the nations of Europe in welcoming Ukrainian refugees versus welcoming the refugees who had come up, mostly Middle Eastern or African countries into Greece and Italy, of course, as well. Yeah, I mean, this is a painful thing for those of us who've been involved in this for a long time to see. I would say I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who works with refugees in Greece, and I admit this is like right after the war started, and I said it's really frustrating to me to see how well the Ukrainians are being treated compared to people from Syria or Afghanistan. And he said we need to celebrate the fact that they are being treated so well. That's how we want everybody to be treated. And now we can see that it can be done in a very competent way. And so let's focus on that. And we want that for those Ukrainians. I mean, they are suffering horrible trauma. And I know because now Humanity Now, my nonprofit, is also working to help refugees coming out of Ukraine as well. But so I want to say, fantastic. We are proving that we can take care of refugees in a really positive way. Let's build on that and try to expand on that. And I mean, maybe that's a little bit of a Pollyanna attitude, but I think we can use it to say, okay, look, you did this in this situation. You're capable of doing it. You've proven you're capable of doing it. So you need to do it for other people as well.
It's a great answer. It's a great book. You're a great author and journalist and writer and person.
Thank you, Pete. So are you. Thank you for doing this.
I want to try to find out, I want to fight with you about something. I want to find out what your weaknesses are. I really just have enjoyed you and liked you so much. I'm like, I really wonder when I like someone so much. I'm like, there must be some shortcomings.
Lots.
I'll find them in our future conversations, which I hope we'll have about all of your work. I want to go back and get more familiar with your other books and what you've written. And my daughter's a budding writer, so I'm going to turn around to your stuff too. And
well, let me know if she needs to talk about it ever.
I basically tell her she'll be replaced by a robot within years. So don't work so hard at this. No, I worry. Do you think about that AI with all that you've worked on? Do you think about that?
I have 2 young adult children, and they keep sending me things from Chat GPT and saying, "Oh my God, this is people's jobs."
Yeah, right. So yeah, I mean, as a writer who is such a wonderful writer, I hate that to see that.
I still think your daughter should write. I definitely think
I've encouraged her to do just about anything that she wants to do, because there's this thing about uncertainty, and you just have no idea what anything's going to lead to. And you bet on the best thing or the most reliable thing.
And you follow what you love if you can.
Yep, I certainly did. So it's hard for me to tell my daughters not to.
Yeah.
Really wonderful talking to you, Dana. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. I appreciate it.
There you go, Dana Sachs. Go get that book. What did you think? Let her know that you heard her here on the show. You can contact her through her website, and more information in today's show notes for her and Bill B. in D.C., who is always a pleasure. Thank you to both Bill and Dana for joining me. Thank you to you for listening, for subscribing, for telling your friends about it, for writing a review, giving 5 stars. Thank you to Pete Coe for the opening. Thank you to John Carroll for the song. I hope to see you tonight at the Hangout. And here's a quote to end the show on. I'm going to try to do this every day to end on a positive note. Michael Altschuler. The bad news is time flies. The good news is you're the pilot. I like that. Stay in the moment. Stay mindful. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Hey, you've been sitting so long. You got the creaky knees. You got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know us right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. We got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Oh, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.